So old-timer, what was your call sign? Gramps? The question, slick with the unearned confidence of youth, sliced through the reverent silence of the memorial. It was thrown by the tallest of three West Point cadets, his crisp gray dress uniform looking almost painfully new against the somber backdrop of polished black granite. His two companions snickered, their posture a blend of parade ground stiffness and casual arrogance. The old man they addressed didn't turn. He remained a still silhouette against the endless river of names carved into the wall. He was slight of build, wearing a simple windbreaker that had seen better decades and a pair of worn jeans. His hair was thin and white, and his hand, deeply wrinkled and marked with age spots, rested gently on the stone, his index finger tracing the letters of a single name, D-A-N-N-Y. Harold Whitman, 81 years old, had heard worse. He'd heard it screamed in languages he barely understood, whispered by the jungle itself, and echoed in the silence of his own mind for over 50 years. The casual mockery of a boy who had never known a day of true hardship was little more than the buzz of a fly. He drew a slow, steadying breath, the cool morning air of Washington, D.C., doing little to quell the heat of memory. The lead cadet, a young man named Thompson with a jawline as sharp as his uniform's creases, took Harold's silence as a sign of weakness or senility. He stepped closer, his polished shoes clicking on the paved walkway. "Hey, I'm talking to you. We asked you a question. This is a place for heroes, you know. Not for guys who look like they wandered off from a nursing home." His friend Reyes chimed in, a smirk playing on his lips. "Maybe he's lost, Tom. Sir, do you need help finding the World War II memorial? That's probably more your speed." Harold finally pulled his hand away from the wall, the cold of the granite lingering on his fingertips. He turned slowly, his movements deliberate, economical. His eyes, a pale and washed-out blue, seemed to hold a depth that swallowed the morning light. They weren't angry or fearful. They were simply observant. He looked at the three of them, at their immaculate uniforms, their proud West Point insignia, their faces unlined by anything more stressful than a final exam. "I'm in the right place," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. It wasn't loud, but it had a peculiar carrying quality, the kind of voice that could cut through the din of a rotor wash. Thompson was not deterred. The old man's calm defiance seemed to fuel his condescension. "Right, and I suppose that jacket is some kind of vintage Special Forces issue. Come on. We're training to be officers in the United States Army. We take this place seriously. We don't appreciate people who come here for a photo op, pretending to be something they're not." He gestured vaguely at Harold's frame. "It's called stolen valor, sir." The accusation hung in the air, ugly and sharp. A few other visitors who had been quietly paying their respects began to notice the confrontation. A family with young children edged away, the parents shooting worried glances over their shoulders. A woman in a park ranger uniform started to drift in their direction. Harold's gaze remained steady. He didn't defend himself. He didn't raise his voice. He simply held their stare, letting their own words fill the space between them. This, more than anything, seemed to infuriate Thompson. It was like punching water. The lack of resistance was maddening. "What, nothing to say for yourself?" Thompson pressed, his voice rising. "No war stories to regale us with? No tales of how you took a hill all by yourself?" "Leave him be, Tom," said Chen, the third cadet, a flicker of unease finally showing in his eyes. "It's not a big deal." "It is a big deal," Thompson snapped, turning on his friend. "The honor of the uniform is a big deal. The sanctity of this memorial is a big deal. We can't just let any vagrant come here and play soldier." The park police officer, a man barely older than the cadets themselves, finally arrived. He saw three immaculate future officers and one disheveled old man. He made a swift and incorrect calculation. "Is there a problem here, gentlemen?" the officer asked, addressing the cadets. "Yes, officer," Thompson said, seizing the opportunity. He stood taller, his voice taking on a tone of official concern. "We were just expressing some concern about this individual. He seems disoriented, and frankly, we're worried he's disrespecting the memorial. We think he might be one of those stolen valor types." The officer nodded, his expression hardening as he turned to Harold. "Sir, I'm going to need to see some identification, and I think it might be best if you moved along. You're causing a disturbance." Harold sighed, a barely audible puff of air. It was not a sigh of defeat, but of weariness. A weariness that was decades old. He reached slowly into the inner pocket of his worn windbreaker. His knuckles brushed against a small, heavy object nestled in the worn fabric. A brass coin, its edges smoothed by countless years of contact with his hand. For a fraction of a second, the manicured green of the National Mall vanished. The air, thick with humidity, became a choking, verdant wall of green. The polite murmurs of tourists were replaced by the shriek of unseen things in the canopy and the distant rhythmic thud of a grenade launcher. A hand, caked in mud and something darker, pressed the coin into his. A young voice, barely a man's, strained with pain. "Don't let him forget me, Hal. Don't you dare." The vision evaporated as quickly as it came. Harold's fingers found what they were looking for, a simple, cracked leather wallet held together by little more than memory. He pulled it out. The officer held out an impatient hand. The small crowd was now larger, their phones held low, discreetly recording the unfolding injustice. They were all waiting to see what would happen next. A man on the edge of the crowd watched the scene with a practiced, critical eye. He was in his late 50s, with a ramrod posture that no civilian life could ever fully relax and the telltale cauliflower ear of a lifelong fighter. Retired Master Sergeant Frank Miller, gunny to anyone who knew him, had spent 30 years in the Marine Corps. He knew what a real warrior looked like, and it had nothing to do with a crisp uniform or a loud voice. It was in the economy of movement, the stillness under pressure, the look in the eyes, and the old man had it in spades. The cadets, for all their polish, were just boys playing dress-up. What truly set Miller's teeth on edge was the young officer's deference to the cadets and the immediate assumption of the old man's guilt. It was a poison he'd seen before. He watched Harold pull out that battered wallet, and a cold certainty settled in his gut. This was wrong, and he was not going to let it stand. Miller backed away from the crowd quietly, melting into the shade of a nearby elm tree. He pulled out his own phone, his thumb flying across the screen to a number he hadn't dialed in years but had never forgotten. It was a direct line to an aide he'd served with in Fallujah, an aide who now worked for a very senior officer at the Pentagon. The phone rang twice before a crisp professional voice answered. "Major Evans' office. It's Frank Miller," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Patch me through to the general. It's an emergency." There was a moment's hesitation. "The general is in a briefing, gunny." "Can I tell him it's about the wall?" Miller cut in. "Tell him it's a Code Jericho, he'll understand." Code Jericho was a term they had used in the old days. It meant a brother was down, surrounded, and needed immediate extraction. It was a code that was never ever to be used lightly. The line went quiet for 10 seconds. Then a new voice, one that radiated authority even through the tiny speaker, came on. "Frank, what is it? You sound like you've seen a ghost." "Worse, General," Miller said, his eyes fixed on the scene 50 yards away. The officer was now examining Harold's ID, a look of skeptical annoyance on his face. "There's a situation down here at the Vietnam Memorial. 3 West Point cadets and a park cop are hassling an old veteran, accusing him of stolen valor, trying to run him off. For God's sake, Frank," the general sighed, a note of deep frustration in his voice. "I'll make a call to the Park Police Command. Get them to pull their man back." "Sir, I don't think that's going to be enough," Miller insisted. "There's something about this old guy, the way he carries himself. He's the real deal, General. I'd bet my pension on it. They forced his name out of him when they checked his ID. Sir, his name is Whitman, Harold Whitman." The silence on the other end of the line was sudden and absolute. It was so profound that Miller thought the call had dropped. When the general finally spoke, his voice was completely changed. All traces of weary bureaucracy were gone, replaced by a tone of shocked, razor-sharp urgency. "Say that name again, gunny." "Whitman, sir. Harold Whitman." "Frank," the general said, his voice now tight and low, a controlled explosion. "Keep your eyes on him. Do not let him leave. Do not let them take him anywhere. I am on my way. ETA 5 minutes. Do you understand me?" "Crystal clear, General," Miller replied. "Good," the general said, and the line went dead. Miller looked back at the scene. He didn't know the full story of Harold Whitman, but he knew one thing for sure. The cavalry was coming. Inside a secure office in the E-ring of the Pentagon, a 2-star Army general, a man who commanded divisions and spoke with presidents, slammed his phone down on his desk. His name was Evans, and his face, normally a placid mask of command, was pale. "Sarah," he barked at his aide, a sharp young major who was instantly at his door. "Sir, cancel my next meeting. Get the car to the front entrance. Now, no security detail, just the driver. Tell him river entrance, lights and siren authorized. Move." The major, stunned by the uncharacteristic urgency, simply said, "Yes, sir," and disappeared. General Evans strode to his closet, shrugging off his service dress jacket and grabbing his full Class A uniform, the one heavy with ribbons and medals. He looked at his own reflection in the glass of a framed photo on his wall, a photo of himself as a young lieutenant standing beside a group of grizzled, hardened men in the central highlands of Vietnam. In the center of the group, A man who wasn't smiling but whose eyes held a fierce protective light had his arm around the young Evans. It was a much younger Harold Whitman. "My God," Evans whispered to the reflection. "They found Spectre." He grabbed his cover and stormed out of the office, his mind racing. There were maybe a dozen people in the entire Department of Defense who would recognize that name and understand the gravity of the situation. Harold Whitman wasn't just a veteran, he was a living legend. A ghost who had walked out of the jungle 50 years ago and vanished into civilian life, refusing all accolades, all interviews, all attempts by the military to honor him, to find him being disrespected by cadets, by the very future of the army he had sacrificed so much for, was not just an embarrassment, it was a sacrilege. Back at the wall, the park police officer handed Harold's driver's license back to him with a dismissive flick of his wrist. "All right, Harold. Says here you live in Virginia. Nice day for a drive. Now I'm telling you, it's time to go." Thompson, the cadet, felt a surge of vindication. The law was on his side. He stepped forward, puffing his chest out. "You heard the officer. You've disrespected this place enough for one day. We should charge you with stolen valor, have them check your records. I bet there's nothing there. I bet you spent the whole war peeling potatoes in a mess hall in Texas." This was the final overreach. Harold had been silent through the mockery of his age and his appearance. He had been patient with their arrogance, but the insult to his service and by extension to the service of the men whose names surrounded him finally struck a nerve. He didn't get angry. He didn't shout. He simply looked at Cadet Thompson, and for the first time the cadet saw something shift in those pale blue eyes. The placid grandfatherly calm was gone, replaced by something ancient and hard, something forged in a place of unimaginable violence and loss. It was a look that stripped away Thompson's uniform and his bravado and saw right through to the scared boy beneath. "You have no idea what you're talking about," Harold said, his voice still quiet but now laced with a steel that made all three cadets and the officer take an involuntary step back. "You stand here in your clean-pressed uniform that has never been stained with anything but sweat, and you presume to know me. You stand on ground consecrated by the blood of better men than you'll ever be, and you throw words like honor around as if you understand their weight." Before Thompson could form a retort, a sound cut through the air, a low, insistent siren growing rapidly closer. A black sedan, the kind that ferries important people around the Capitol, screeched to a halt on the service road 100 feet away. The doors opened, and out stepped a man in the immaculate green service uniform of a Major General of the United States Army. He moved with a speed and purpose that seemed to bend the very air around him. The park officer saw the 2 stars on the general's shoulders and felt a cold knot of dread form in his stomach. The cadets saw the uniform, the rank, the aura of absolute command, and they snapped to attention, their bodies rigid with shock and reflexive discipline. The general didn't even glance at them. His eyes were locked on Harold Whitman. He closed the distance in a dozen long strides, his face a mixture of awe, relief, and profound respect. He stopped 3 feet in front of Harold, his back ramrod straight. The crowd, now utterly silent, watched as the 2-star general raised his hand in a salute so sharp, so perfect it seemed to cleave the air. "Colonel Whitman," the general's voice boomed, clear and strong, echoing across the Memorial Plaza. "Sir, it is an honor to see you again." Harold looked at the general, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. "Evans? My God, you're all grown up." He gave a weary, almost pained half-smile and returned the salute with the casual, familiar gesture of an old soldier. The general dropped his salute and turned to face the 3 petrified cadets and the now trembling park police officer. His eyes were chips of ice. "Do you 3 have any idea who you were speaking to?" he asked, his voice deceptively calm. Thompson, Reyes, and Chen stood frozen, unable to speak. "I asked you a question. Do you know who this is?" Thompson finally found his voice, stammering. "No, General, sir." "No, you do not," General Evans thundered, his voice now resonating with cold fury. "Because men like him are not in your textbooks. They are the stuff of hushed stories told late at night at the Special Forces qualification course. They are legends that you, in your pampered ignorance, could not possibly comprehend." He turned his body slightly, addressing not just the cadets but the entire assembled crowd. "This is Colonel Harold Whitman, United States Army, retired. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, 3 Silver Stars, 5 Bronze Stars for valor, and 6 Purple Hearts. He didn't peel potatoes in Texas, cadet. He spent 3 tours in the deadliest parts of Vietnam with the 5th Special Forces Group." The general took a step closer to the cadets, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. "You asked for his call sign, a joke to you, a name to toss around. His call sign was Spectre. He was the ghost of the A Shau Valley. For 2 years, the enemy put a bounty on his head so high they could have bought a helicopter with it. They never collected, because every time they thought they had him cornered, he would vanish, leaving nothing but their own dead behind. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. The crowd was mesmerized. Gunny Miller, watching from the edge, felt a surge of pride so fierce it almost brought tears to his eyes. And on a rainy night in 1968, after his entire recon team was wiped out, after he himself was wounded in 3 places, he single-handedly held off a battalion-sized assault on a firebase, saving the lives of over 100 American soldiers. For that action, President Johnson awarded him this nation's highest honor for combat valor. General Evans reached out and gently tapped Harold's chest, right over his heart. This man is a recipient of the Medal of Honor. He is one of the greatest warriors this army has ever produced, and you accused him of stolen valor. The shame that washed over the cadets was a physical thing. Their faces, once so cocky, were now pale and slack-jawed. Thompson looked as if he might be sick. The general turned his withering gaze on the park police officer. And you stood by. You took their side. I want your name and badge number. You can expect a call from your chief of police and the Secretary of the Interior before lunch. The officer fumbled for his notepad, his hands shaking. But then Harold raised a hand. That's enough, Bill, he said softly to the general. General Evans stopped, turning back to his old commander. Sir? They're just boys, Harold said, his voice filled with that profound weariness again. He looked at the 3 cadets, and the hardness in his eyes had softened into something closer to pity. They've been taught to see the uniform, not the man. They've been taught about the glory, but not the cost. He turned and placed his hand back on the wall, back on the name of Danny Ross. This is the cost, he said, his voice thick with emotion. He was 19. He was a radio operator from Ohio who loved baseball. He was scared every single second he was in country. And on the day he died, he was braver than anyone I have ever known. He ran through a storm of machine gun fire to drag me to cover after I was hit. He took 3 bullets meant for me. Harold looked from the wall to the cadets. This place isn't about us, the ones who came home. It's not a stage for old men to tell war stories or for young men to prove their patriotism. It is a tombstone. It is here so that we remember them. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the old brass coin, holding it in his palm. It's here so we don't forget. The morning sun caught the worn surface of the coin. For a final fleeting moment, Harold wasn't at the memorial. He was lying in the mud, his legs shattered. Danny Ross was leaning over him, pressing the coin into his hand. The kid was smiling, a bloody, terrible grin. This was my old man's, from the big one. He said it would keep me safe. Guess it's your turn now, Lieutenant. Danny's eyes were bright with fear and a fierce, impossible courage. Make 'em remember us, Spectre. Then the sound of the machine gun had returned, and the light in Danny's eyes went out forever. The fallout from the incident was swift and decisive. General Evans personally escorted the 3 cadets to a waiting car. They were not returning to West Point as conquering heroes of a weekend trip, but as shamed individuals facing a disciplinary board. The story, kept out of the press by the general's influence, became an internal legend at the academy. A cautionary tale of the highest order. A new block of instruction was added to the curriculum for all first-year cadets. A mandatory multi-day seminar on veteran interaction, humility, and the true meaning of service, taught by combat veterans. The young park police officer was reassigned to desk duty pending a full review. 2 days later, a formal handwritten letter of apology from the superintendent of West Point was delivered to Harold Whitman's quiet home in suburban Virginia. Harold asked for no punishment for the boys. He only asked that they be made to understand. 3 months later, on a crisp autumn Saturday, Harold returned to the wall. It was his ritual. He went not on holidays when the crowds were thick, but on quiet mornings when he could feel the stillness and commune with the names. As he stood before Danny's name, he heard footsteps approach. He turned to see 3 young men, no longer in uniform but in simple civilian clothes. It was Thompson, Reyes, and Chen. They stopped a respectful distance away, their heads bowed. Thompson, his face stripped of all its former arrogance, held a small polishing cloth and a bucket of clean water. He looked at Harold, his eyes filled with a humility that had been forged in the fire of his disgrace. "Sir," Thompson began, his voice quiet and steady. We volunteered for the wall cleaning detail for the rest of the year. We wanted to say again how sorry we are. We were arrogant, and we were ignorant. We failed to uphold the values we swore to live by." Harold looked at them for a long moment, then gave a slow nod. He didn't offer platitudes or easy forgiveness. He didn't need to. He could see the change in them. It was in their posture, in their eyes. They had begun to understand the weight. "The wall is always in need of a good cleaning," Harold said simply. He turned back to the polished granite, and the three young men began their work, silently, carefully, respectfully washing the names of the dead. For a while, the four of them stood together, the old ghost of the jungle and the three young soldiers who had finally learned their first real lesson about honor. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The wall spoke for them all. If you were moved by Harold's story, please like this video, share it with someone who respects our veterans, and subscribe to Veteran Valor for more stories of unassuming heroes. Your support helps us ensure these incredible legacies are never forgotten.